1,000 years ago, Europe learned one of the most brutal lessons in economics. Sometimes it is cheaper to pay your enemy than to fight them. This is the story of Danegeld, a payment system that began as a desperate ransom and evolved into an early form of taxation. Plain and simple, it was protection money dressed up as diplomacy. And the terrifying part is this: the logic behind it never disappeared. We are still living under versions of Danegeld today. The only difference is that the collectors wear suits instead of chainmail. Welcome to Paper Empire's history. Today, we tell the story of how the Vikings became the fathers of the modern tax system. Picture this. The year is 991. The English countryside is smoldering, and Viking longships are on the horizon once again. These weren't small raids. They were coordinated attacks capable of devastating entire towns. At the Battle of Malden, English forces lost. The Vikings didn't just take plunder, they demanded a price to leave. King Aethelred, later known as the Unready, agreed to pay them 10,000 pounds of silver, an astronomical sum for the time. That payment was the birth of a system that would haunt English rulers for decades: Danegeld, literally Dane Money. At first glance, it might look like cowardice. Why pay an invader instead of fighting? But the logic was coldly financial. Armies were expensive. Wars drained treasuries and destabilized kingdoms. A pile of silver, while painful, was cheaper and faster. Think of it as an early cost-benefit analysis. Pay today, avoid destruction tomorrow. But of course, once you start paying, the payments never end. The Vikings understood the psychology of tribute better than anyone. They had discovered a business model: protection money on a national scale. In 1012, the king paid 48,000 pounds. 2 years later, 72,000 pounds of silver. While a peasant might handle a few silver pennies in a lifetime, kings were paying tons of it, and they didn't pay this from their own pockets. They raised it from the people through taxation. What began as a desperate bribe turned into a structured system of revenue extraction. Here is where the story becomes more than just Viking history. Danegeld blurred the line between plunder and taxation. It started as extortion, demanded by foreign raiders, but soon kings realized that the same mechanisms could serve their own power. Why wait for Vikings to demand silver? You could collect it yourself and use it to pay for armies, castles, or to buy off political rivals. In a twisted irony, the Vikings taught Europe how to systematize taxation. The payments meant to repel invaders became the backbone of centralized state finance. Archaeology confirms this wealth transfer. Massive hoards of silver minted in England and Germany have been unearthed across Scandinavia. These weren't random spoils. They were the accumulated proceeds of Danegeld, a river of silver flowing north. For a Viking chieftain, this was more efficient than endless raiding. Why risk your men when a king would willingly hand over wealth? But the real brilliance, or evil, was the psychological lock. Once a ruler paid Danegeld, he signaled weakness. Other Viking leaders saw the opportunity. Why fight a kingdom that has proven it will pay? Tribute became addictive, both for the collectors and for those buying peace. This was the first great protection racket of European history, and it taught a dangerous lesson. Paying off your oppressor only encourages more oppression. The echoes are obvious. Think of modern bailouts, where governments shovel billions of dollars to banks deemed too big to fail. Think of businesses paying monthly fees to the mafia to avoid destruction. The form has changed, but the psychology is identical. Once you demonstrate you will pay, you trap yourself in a cycle. The Vikings didn't invent raiding. They invented the subscription model for survival, and 1,000 years later, the world still runs on it. By the reign of King Canute the Great, Danegeld had become routine. It was no longer just collected to pay off raiders, but to finance the empire. Think about it. The men who once demanded tribute at sword point were now sitting on the throne, collecting the same payments, but calling it law. The raider had become the tax collector. This feels disturbingly familiar to the modern state structure. Once a revenue stream is discovered, it is never abandoned. Temporary taxes, introduced during a crisis, become permanent after the crisis passes. The mechanics of Danegeld were brutally efficient. Silver flowed from the bottom, peasants, to the top, kings. It turned entire kingdoms into wealth pumps. Long before economists invented the term, this was regressive taxation. Look at how this logic survived into the modern age. In 2008, when governments rushed to rescue collapsing banks, taxpayers footed the bill. The justification was exactly the same as King Aethelred's. It is cheaper to pay than to let the destruction continue. Just as England handed silver to the Vikings, modern citizens handed trillions to banks. In both cases, the ordinary person paid, and the powerful were shielded. and the psychology hasn't changed. When you show you will protect the system at any cost, you signal to the powerful you can come back for more. Banks, just like Vikings, learn that weakness pays. Protection money becomes built into the system. The only difference is that chests of silver have been replaced by corporate bonuses and inflated balance sheets. The raiders have been replaced by bankers, but the business model is eternal. Danegeld teaches us something chilling. Financial systems are not designed for fairness. They are designed for stability, and usually at the expense of those at the bottom, for the stability of those at the top. Look around today. Rising taxes, inflation eating wages, and bailouts disguised as stability. The same mechanism is still extracting from society. Kings discovered how to rebrand emergency payments as legitimate taxes. Modern governments discovered how to rebrand emergency bailouts as economic stabilization. Danegeld worked for a while, but it carried an inherent weakness. It made kingdoms soft targets. Chronic taxation bred unrest. The system that was supposed to guarantee peace destabilized royal authority. So what is the lesson? Danegeld shows us that paying for peace is never really peace. It is just a delay. Once you start handing over your silver or your tax dollars to protect the powerful, the demands never stop. The Vikings discovered it. Bankers rediscovered it. Politicians perfected it. The lesson is this: you cannot rely on any financial system to put your interests first. The system is inclined to protect its own survival. History doesn't repeat exactly, but its rhythms are hard to ignore. 1,000 years ago, the Vikings invented the subscription for survival. Today, we are still trapped in cycles where wealth flows upward under the guise of protection. The names changed, but the mechanism didn't. Real wealth comes when you see the system clearly, when you recognize Danegeld in its modern forms and refuse to believe that endless payments are the price of peace.
If what I shared today helped you see the world from a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe. Because history always has an answer. You just need to look from the right angle.